That's reassuring. I always say that. So just before we start then, I just want to remind you of what's required. This is for the 3240. I spoke to the 3230 people yesterday. The hot topic essay, if you want to call it that, or review, is due on the 5th. Some people have written to me, asking for clarification about it. So essentially what you need to do, and it's written down, you've got to get a topic in food safety, raw milk. Let's just choose one off the top of the head. Seems raw milk all the time these days, but raw milk. So what you'll write is a kind of opening summary about what the issue is. And, and obviously with raw milk, it's it should be a consumer preference? What's the health benefits? What's the food safety risk? And then what you do after that, you write the actual arguments to and against and what the supporting evidence is. So you'll say, well, the health benefits of raw milk have been proven by whoever it is, and the food safety of raw milk has been proved, or lack of food safety has been proven by these papers. Then at the end, you write an opinion. Why? What do you think? Do you think, in this case, raw milk is good, bad, or indifferent? So raw milk's only an example. You could choose a wide variety of things. Leafy greens, for example, food safety with leafy greens is debate. What's the one? Yeah, the way the FDA handles foodborne illness and things like that's a debate. And so you'll get sort of that sort of subject. And I think, I forget what the word count is. I think it's about 3,000 words, isn't it? But you don't take exactly to do it from memory. So yeah, just think of a subject. Like I say, it doesn't have to be raw milk. It doesn't have to be fresh produce. It could be the food safety of takeaway meals or things like that. Anyway, I won't try and put seeds in your mind. Now, the other thing we've got to think about is the final exam. And as I mentioned to you, I was asking for a schedule for the final exam, and apparently not giving one. So that's news to me. But anyway, so what I've decided to do, I'm going to release the exam on the 11th of December, and until the end of the 16th of December to complete it. Now, I'll talk about the exam towards the end, because if I start going into time now, it's people forget and it won't be up with shoes. But it's going to be the same format as the midterm exam, but not include materials in the midterm, include materials after the midterm, along with the guest presenters. And we'll talk, and people's asked me saying, well, what does formatting mean? Well, these kind of things, formatting is giving instructions, the way the question's laid out. But like I said, I'm going to go over that at the end of the course, so just before we finish next Friday. All right, so without much more ado, if there's any questions, you can just put them on the chat or open the line up, whichever you prefer. And today we're going to start talking about risk analysis, that's it. Risk analysis then. So risk analysis is a very interesting subject, especially in the age of COVID, isn't it? Because we always seem to hear about models and that. In a lot of ways, that's what risk analysis is. It's a bit like, it is based on statistics. It is based on aspects of predicting what's going to happen based on what knowledge you know. And if you think about statistics, it's going to be a case of estimating and sometimes being accurate. Now, there is a subject called bioinformatics, and is anyone interested in going into bioinformatics? You can open your line or put the chat up. Oh, no one's there today, is it? So bioinformatics is an oh, no one is. Hang on, I'm getting some interference. I'm just going to. So it was just something on the thing. So bioinformatics is the application of statistics and science and computer science. And what this does is actually combine those two areas into what we call risk analysis. And bioinformatics is one of those jobs where it's going to be very critical in the end. Hang on, I'm getting... No, I was just getting some sort of warning signs. The internet connection is good, so I won't go on video. I'll just go on this. So, as I was saying, bioinformatics is this combination of using statistics, science, and computer science. If you want a job in the future, bioinformatics is where it's going to be. Essentially, what we have in the bioinformatics area is a lot of computer scientists who don't actually really understand the science behind things. So, or the food science or food safety. So if you are looking for a job, and the reason why I was asking you is the fact that bioinformatics is where the big job areas are going to be. So that's just a career tip, if you want to call it that. All right. So getting back to risk analysis then is that we're on the road to HACCP. And part of HACCP is identifying hazards, and not only identifying hazards, but obviously addressing them through implementation of critical control points and things like that. Now, the thing is that when we're doing a hazard identification, we have to kind of choose those ones that are relevant, likely to happen. Now, in the new regulations, there is a part of them that says, well, you've got to address the hazard, but you've got to be also address the foreseen hazards. So foreseen hazards are those which aren't obvious, but they could occur. Now, the thing is that we can think of lots of different hazards, when we think about food systems and things like that. Oh, yeah, take your mic off. I mean, your mic off, if you would, before we hear anything else, I guess. so before going about hazards, we have to identify those that are likely to occur and rank them, because we only can really take care of the top 4 or 5, and we need to have an idea about how do we sort them out. So what we're going to be doing today is in the terms of learning objectives, is understanding the risk analysis. And I'll say right from the start, this is essentially a very 33,000 mile overview or high up overview. The actual aspects of risk analysis, if you do want to get into it, is mainly statistics. Essentially it's those kind of things. So what we're looking at then is why we do risk analysis, how we do it, and all the different components to it. Right, so when we talk about HACCP plans, as I say, we've got to develop a HACCP plan in terms of identifying the hazards and addressing them. And when we think about hazards, it's not just biological. You've got physical hazards like nails, clippings, hair, wood, plastic, glass, you name it. You've got chemical hazards such as chemical agents, antibiotics, sanitizers, but then you've got the biological hazards, and there's about 1,400 known pathogenic species. But obviously we can't take all of those. We have to kind of select those that are relevant to the food product we have, because if we try to do all of those products, then our HACCP system will be unmanageable. And in the early days of HACCP, that was kind of the issue. Well, one, they didn't really know what hazards were there because no one had bothered doing risk analysis then. But the other thing is that they tried to get these sort of schemes or scenarios, as we'll call them, which were unlikely. I'm trying to think of one. Getting sort of what was the one? Oh, I can't think of one offhand. But yeah, unlikely hazards, isn't it? All right then. So as I said, with risk analysis, we're basically looking at probabilities. We're looking at what's likely to occur. Like everything's got a probability. You know, me winning the Nobel Prize as a probability, very unlikely. But after saying all that, you know, there is a probability to it. But if you had to rank these in terms of fatal outcomes, where would you be? Like, do you think the most fatal activity or cause is foodborne illness? Is it airplane crash, lion attack, a firework accident, hot water exposure? So rank the one, if you rank the one that's the most dangerous to the one that's least, and then we'll see what people think. Right, let's see. Well, I don't know what percentage it is, but you know, all these things have odds. Like with a fireworks accident, there's about a 1 in a million chance. For foodborne illness, there's 1 in 3 million. I think hot water exposure, looking at my list, is 1 in 5 million. Airline crashes are 1 in 10 million. And lion attack is 1 in 32 million. Now, the point is, what I'm trying to make here is that there must have a sort of procedure to work out those odds. And what the procedure is what we call risk analysis. You know, basically the probability of and likelihood and the severity of the outcome are all calculated based on probability. Now, when we're doing risk analysis, the reason why we're doing it, and I think I said this already, is that we need to identify those hazards that are going to be relevant. So when we think about any egg product, well, salmonella, isn't it? When we think about any sort of beef product, we'll talk about E. coli. Dairy products, well, E. coli, salmonella, listeria. But what we have to do is identify those hazards and then say, well, what's the likelihood and what's the outcome of those hazards? And what it really does is allow targeting of resources. So, for example, when we're making our hazard plan, we can justify our choice of hazard. So if we're doing a raw milk cheese, for example, we can choose E. coli 157. Now, what it also does, especially here in Canada, we have a risk-based food inspection system. So in the food inspection system, we basically rank different facilities based on the risk. So the highest risk is a deli meat factory, isn't it? So we focus inspection there. But say a brewery like Sleeman's, well, that's going to be very low risk. So we wouldn't have an inspector there, would we? So that's how they do it. What's the risk of a facility contaminating products? And also what we can do with risk analysis is prioritize areas. So when COVID struck, obviously the risk of that was the highest one. So we could get resources like research and everything focused on that. And some people say we focus too much, but that's another question, isn't it? But we can also support our choice of interventions. So, you know, I don't want to talk about COVID all the time, but COVID's a good example, isn't it? So it's not food safety, but when people say masks, you know, somebody worked out the probability if we wore masks, we would get this number of cases. If we didn't wear masks, we would get X, Y, Z number of cases. So risk analysis is good for that. And some people, you know, do argue saying, well, it's just numbers. It's a bit like mystics working. And in this sort of COVID outbreak we're having now, this pandemic, many people criticize the risk analysis because they're kind of overplaying it. And in a lot of ways, they're probably true, because a lot of those people who do risk analysis are statisticians. They've got no real grasp on reality. That's another matter for another day. So when we're doing risk analysis, there's 3 components to it. The first component is a risk assessment. So with risk assessment, what we're doing is identifying the risk and then seeing how big the risk is. Like, is it likely to occur? And what is going to be the outcome of it? And it's all down to being, well, where it's possible to be science-based. Because when you come to do auditing, you've got to justify your hazards. And you justify those based on the science. So risk assessment is essentially identifying, prioritizing, and establishing what the risk actually is. And then you get risk communication, and risk communication is a bit different. Like traditionally in risk analysis, what it really means is how do you take that your knowledge of risk and translate it to somebody who could use it. Now, going back to COVID again, which I shouldn't do, but I will. One thing you've noticed throughout the pandemic is the poor communication from public health. You know, masks were in one day, out the next day, in back in, and we're not allowed to do this, not allowed to do that. That's risk communication, not maybe at its best, but it's what it is. So, but in reality, risk communication is a two-way street. So, for example, there's not a new pathogen, but one of concern, a Klebsiella pneumoniae, multiple antibiotic resistance, and people are encountering it in foods. And so what this means is that it's a potential foodborne pathogen for the future. And so you need to communicate that with the risk analysis people who can then look at the probability. So risk communication is a two-way street, not just a single street. And then risk management is where we can do things about it. So what can we do to mitigate the risk? And if you want a cartoon, which is always good, I suppose, what we have then is risk communication is this two-way. Oh no, my pen's not working now. That's not good, is it? There you go. Risk perception is risk communication. Saying, well, there's a risk out there. Risk assessment is talking about what's the likelihood of the outcome, and risk management is what can we do if it happens. So in this case, it's obvious that the boulder's on the edge, so they can perceive the risk. They're assessing, will it fall or not? And then when it does fall, what should we do? Simple as that, isn't it? And as I mentioned to you, in a classic risk analysis model, you do a risk assessment and think about risk management and communication. But in reality, it's a two-way street, a two-way or three-way flow of information. So in risk assessment, what we're looking at is identifying the hazard, looking at if it will grow, will it increase or decrease in counts, and what is the supporting evidence for that? So that's basically our hazard plan. Now, our risk management system are those things we've talked about before, SSOPs, Standard Sanitation Operating Practices, and also maybe food safety policy. Now, the thing is that you can introduce these interventions and cause another issue. So, we talked about a little bit about Al-Cyclobacillus, for example, and, where we pasteurize juices and that wakes the Al-Cyclobacillus up and cause them to spoil. So that's one example, but there's other examples as well. So risk management is how do we take care of a risk? And then risk communication, as I mentioned to you, is this two-way flow of information. Is there something we should be aware of? And so, for example, Klebsiella pneumoniae, and what can we do with that risk? And how do we communicate it to the stakeholders and things like that? All right, so taking it from the top then, the risk assessment. So in terms of risk assessment, what we're trying to do is identify the hazard and then calculate the probability of encountering it in dangerous levels in food systems. So what we find then is that we identify the hazard first and look at the hazard characterization. Does it grow? Does it die? And then the exposure assessment. What's the infectious dose? And how often will we encounter it? And that's your risk characterization. So in terms of risk assessment then, we identify hazards by various means. Obviously, the big one is foodborne illness outbreaks. And if you had to be honest, I think that's about 90% of hazard identification. You get an outbreak of E. coli 026 in flour, and suddenly, we have to think about 026 in flour. Like before that, nobody ever did. So typically, with hazard identification, we do base it on outbreak data. But also what we have to do is think about where the pathogen comes from. So, give you an example, beef, for example. We know with beef, we've got E. coli 157. And we know that if people are the sort of risk groups who eat it, which is kind of broad, isn't it? And the reason why we went over the intrinsic, extrinsic factors in that, I think it's unit 3, is that we need to know what it's likely to do. So in meat, for example, will it grow? Will it die? Will it just stay the same? So these are the things we need to know. Then what we have to do is look at the exposure analysis. So how often will somebody be exposed to a lethal or a infectious dose of E. coli 157? And as we mentioned, isn't it, typically 10 to 100 cells could cause illness, so it's very low. And that goes to the dose response. And then we look at the severity. Is it going to kill somebody like E. coli 157? Or is it like norovirus, where you get a very temporary sickness? And the risk characterization, if you like, is the exposure times the hazard. So it's a bit like buying lottery tickets, isn't it? If you buy one lottery ticket a year, then your odds of winning the lottery are going to be very low. But if you buy 1,000 tickets a week, I guess your odds are the same. But in reality, your odds would improve, wouldn't they? So I think you get the idea. So it's basically how often we'll be exposed to a lethal dose or infectious dose of the pathogen. So when we're looking at epidemiology links, as I mentioned to you, essentially we look at historical links. So typically E. coli 157 in beef products, and we look at outbreak data, saying, oh, well, we had salmonella in onions, so we have to consider that. And it's a very tricky area because you can say, I suppose, relying on outbreak data is not very good because you're essentially catching something that's already happened. And sometimes you want to catch it before it happens. But, even that can be disastrous. Now, I'm going to, remind of non-0157 E. coli. So non-0157 sugar toxin E. coli was prevalent. And ordinarily, you would say, well, yes, that's going to be a hazard in meat products. But the reality is, when you looked at the outbreak data, there was hardly any outbreaks linked to meat. But they still went along with policy to bring it in because they say, well, it could be a risk that could occur. And it was very contentious in terms of saying, well, we haven't really got a good test for it. It's expensive to do testing. So what you normally find because of that, it's basically we have to have an outbreak to prove that something actually is there. So that's the reason why that is. So you look at the historical links, like the salmonella in onions. Well, you've got to think, well, how often did it occur? Well, it's only occurred once, basically last 2 months ago. And you think about the severity, well, not many people died from it. I don't think anyone died. I think it was about 1,000 cases, 1,500 cases though. You've got to think about the end consumer. Are they in a risk group? Are they immunocompromised, or are they fit and healthy? And what happens to the pathogen? Does it grow in number or not? So with hazard identification, then you basically use outbreak data. You might get expert review panels, as they did with the non-0157. I think they were trying to be proactive, but by being proactive, they kind of put a burden on the industry. You get government agencies suddenly coming out saying, oh, we should look at this pathogen in this food system. So that's where you get identification. So you get it through regulation, like listeria, for example. You get it through science literature, prevalence data, and sometimes you get expert reviews. So when we're looking at all these risks, then you essentially in the first start, you put any kind of pathogen you want on. You've got to consider, well, maybe norovirus will get onto that hamburger. E. coli 157 will, maybe salmonella, maybe Clostridia. So you put all these list of possible hazards, and then you categorize them in terms of, well, it's very low, like norovirus. Yes, it gives you illness for about 24 hours, but you don't really need medical attention for that. You get the medium ones, which you could get medical attention. So salmonella is a good one, things like that. And then you get the high ones, which obviously 0157, you're looking at Clostridium botulinum. Now, so you've got that risk identification in terms of health concerns, but also what you have is this business aspect. And going back to COVID, this is what the risk analysis is saying, well, it's not just a case of saying, oh, we're going to get these many deaths and these many illnesses. What they're weighing up, and you can see this in how the COVID pandemic's playing out, is the business aspect. So, you know, if you wanted to stop the pandemic, you would literally lock people in the houses for 2 weeks and say no one's coming out. But, you know, if you did that, the things would just fall apart. So, but in terms of normal risk analysis, is that you've got to see what would that hazard do to your sales. So, for example, if we have a norovirus outbreak in a restaurant, a single restaurant in McDonald's, for example, well, it's going to have a minimal effect, isn't it? You know, it's going to be there, it's going to be over, and nobody's going to be worried about it. But then you get those which have got notable losses. So, for example, when you pull onions out, for example, from the market, a recall, a product recall, you're going to have very significant losses of sales. So that's going to be a large expense. And if you want to think about one, I would say the maple leaf outbreak, I think they said it cost them $300 million or something like that. I could be wrong. But, you know, in terms of lost revenue, I do know the one on the spinach outbreak of 0157 back in 2006, their market about 30% loss. But then you get the devastating loss. It's basically high losses and closing your business down. Peanut Corporation of America is a good example of that. Cost from your salmonella eggs, that was a good example of that. You know, where this outbreak would have totally devastated the sector or the business. So the way you identify which hazards are important is that you use this sort of risk analysis grid. So what this risk assessment grid, should I say, does is you kind of say, well, what's the likelihood of occurrence? Like, all right, we'll choose norovirus and we've got a deli meat. What is the likelihood that it's actually going to cause illness? And so you've got high, medium, or low, or remote of occurrence. But then you've got this other one saying, well, what's the consequence? So taking a norovirus example, well, we know norovirus, especially in deli meats that are handled at retail or handled in a delicatessen or Subway, whatever you want to call them, it could be high, but the consequences could be low. So you basically, as we talk about, you've got likelihood of occurrence, how often, the severity, is it going to be fatal or is it just going to give mild illness or no illness? All right, so let's see if you're good at risk analysis. So we're talking about raw milk here, and we're talking about E. coli 157. So if you had to put E. coli 157 associated with raw milk, where would you put it? Would you say, well, it's going to be very frequent and it's going to be very severe? Or do you think, well, you know, it's remote, so there's hardly any chance of it happening, and it's not going to be so serious. It might be a medium risk or something like that. So where would you put E. coli 157 on raw milk in this on this grid? All right. Oh, a bit all over the place. Well, the thing about E. coli 157, as we've learned, it's very virulent. So obviously it can be fatal. And in raw milk, you know, the prevalence it depends obviously on the farm itself. But we do know the prevalence of E. coli 157 in cattle is high. So therefore, the milk produced by the cow would be high. So that would be placed there. And I think I'm making this too easy, but we'll see. Thinking about pasteurized milk now, I don't know why I keep going on about milk for, but anyway, where would you put E. coli 157 on this risk matrix based on of pasteurized milk this time? So you got raw milk, but now you got pasteurized milk. So what's the likelihood that it will occur? And what's the consequence of it occurring? All right, let's have a look. Yeah. Oh, a difference of opinion. Well, we know with pasteurized milk, the pasteurization reduces E. coli 157. That's kind of its purpose. But the severity is still there, isn't it? So the likelihood is that we've got a remote chance of getting E. coli 157 from pasteurized milk. Why we don't hear about outbreaks with pasteurized milk unless it's post-process contamination or something's gone wrong. But we do know the severity is still there. So I think you get the idea now. So it's all down to likelihood and potential. So when we think about not pasteurized milk, when we think about processed meats, then, to cut a long story short, we know that there's various hazards. Listeria, we know that from deli meat. You can get salmonella, Clostridium perfringens, and pathogenic E. coli. But we're going to stick to Listeria just to give an idea what risk analysis is about. So when we look at Listeria, then, we're going to think about how virulent it is, who's going to be exposed to it, and would those high-risk groups and also other groups be exposed at a infectious dose? That's what we have to kind of figure out. So who is exposed? Well, we know deli meats are kind of a very broad range, going from infants right through to the elderly. And within that group, there are people at risk, the elderly, the young, immunocompromised, and pregnant women. So that tells you part of the risk puzzle. So we know we've got high-risk groups eating the product. And then we look at the historical links, and you don't have to go far to find all the outbreaks linked to Listeria, Maple Leaf, Pilgrim's Pride, all those. And then we've got to consider saying, well, what products specifically at risk? And we know from our Unit 3 sort of intrinsic, extrinsic factors is that Listeria grows at cold temperatures. It grows over extended storage times at those temperatures. And also, if the product's low acid, i.e. above pH 4.5, or above a water activity of 0.92, these are all going to be supporting the growth of Listeria. And from the virulence, we know, don't we, that it's noteworthy that 30% of the people who acquire listeriosis actually succumb to it. So that's a very high mortality rate. And what we need to do then is saying, well, we know it's a pathogen. We know we get various virulence. So, some very virulent, some not so virulent. But how many Listeria is a dangerous level? How many will be an infectious dose? And then what the statisticians do is get with their numbers. So they'll take data from animal studies, for example. So, injecting poor mice with Listeria and then seeing what the dose was to kill them and extrapolating the results. They also can actually take outbreak data. So those occasions where they find the smoking gun, which is basically an unopened package of product that's been implicated in an outbreak, they can take that and use that to estimate numbers. Now, as always, and I know I keep going on about it, but these are just probabilities. There's no way for sure for knowing if this is correct or not. And it's noteworthy in the Maple Leaf outbreak that the packs had only 1,000 CFU of Listeria in, whereas the risk analysis people would say, well, no, you need at least 10 to the 10, 10 to the 9 to cause illness. Now, what they do in this model, as you probably guessed, is that the infectious dose to cause illness, the probability of causing illness, is less than it is for a young healthy person, and that's due to being immunocompromised. So essentially, what you're doing here, isn't it? And I think you get it now, is that you're saying, well, this is the dangerous level. So any level of Listeria that reaches this point is likely to cause illness. So when we calculate the probability of illness, obviously it depends on the frequency of consumption and the level of consumption. So in terms of exposure assessment then, we've figured out what the infectious dose is, we've figured out what products could be the source of Listeria. Then we're going to try and figure out, well, what is the likelihood and the frequency you're going to be exposed to an infectious dose? And the thing is that unless you know take a whole population, you can't do it. You know, you can't say, well, I don't know how many people eat deli meat a day and things like that. But you can kind of estimate it, can't you, based on sales, based on surveys, and extrapolating those surveys to the wider population. Now, as I keep saying, it's all real guesswork. So modelers estimate things, and what they can do is qualitative and quantitative risk assessment. So qualitative is a ranking, but quantitative generates numbers which can be used in modeling. So the first thing you've got to think about, isn't it, is saying, well, we're going to do a risk assessment, but we're going to figure out where listeria comes from, what levels, and where does it go. And with listeria, we know, don't we, from our sort of Unit 5, whatever I think it was Unit 5, listeria is everywhere. It's in the environment, it gets onto certain foods, it can grow, and so it's a real issue. The likelihood of encountering it is very high. Now, we know also, don't we, that in processing plants, listeria becomes endemic. And what they also found is that listeria can become endemic within retail sector as well. In the retail supermarkets, there was an interesting marketplace the other week there with Jim, talking about supermarket food safety or lack thereof. So what we're going to do then in our risk analysis is saying, well, we know all these different points in the chain are a possible source of listeria, but can we calculate which is going to be the riskiest and which would be of benefit in terms of tackling listeria? So we're going to focus on retail just for this one, but as you can imagine, we do it for all different stages. So in retail then, as I mentioned to you, when you go to the shop, you've got a choice, haven't you? You can buy your meat pre-packed, or you can buy your meat at the delicatessen counter, which has been sliced. And as we talked about at length, isn't it, is that some products are basically don't have any additives in because consumers say, well, we don't want additives, whereas others will. And I think you can imagine we have different risks associated with those two product streams. So say, for example, we have a growth inhibitor, diacetate, and we have at retail a pre-packed, you know, or retail slice at the deli counter. You can imagine all these different scenarios, i.e. growth inhibitors, packed, unpacked, have different risk profiles of being contaminated with listeria. Because, and I think you guessed already by now, the highest risk, isn't it, without a growth inhibitor, sliced at retail, because retail have got no kind of food safety standards. So you can have a higher risk of getting listeria in that product compared to, say, one with a growth inhibitor, which is pre-packed. Now, what they do is then get this cumulative factor, and this is a bit head scratching, so I'll take it slowly. So cumulative factors are essentially probability curves. And what they did in this case to calculate this is that they went out, the USDA did, and they took 3,500 samples of pre-packed meat, and they collected 3,500 samples of retail sliced meat, and they looked for listeria. And what they found was these, from the data, is that, is that the pre-packed meat had a low incidence of listeria. I think it was 0.17%, whereas the sliced meat, the deli counter, had 1.4% prevalence of listeria. Now, they did enumeration, and they worked out these curves here called the, I'm going to try and draw a line, not very good. So what we're saying here is that based on their sort of results of their prevalence data, what they did then is extrapolate it to the whole industry. And so, so what they did, so I've got a bit of an issue here. That's all right. So what they did is that they looked at the probability of encountering listeria at certain levels. So what this graph means essentially is that in pre-packed meats, where we have 0.4% prevalence, when we do get listeria, there's about a 99% chance it'll be very low, below 0 log CFU. Now, when we've got retail sliced meat, we encounter a lot of the times Listeria at the presence of 2 log CFU. So essentially what we're saying here is the probability of encountering it. But just to see if you got this right, all right, so see if you get this right then. So based on this curve, what does it actually mean to you? Does it mean that we're likely to encounter infectious dose of Listeria 99% of the time if we buy meat at retail or sliced meat? Does it mean if encountered, then it'll be present around about 2 log CFU? Does it mean that the chances of encountering Listeria is the same in pre-packed versus retail sliced? Or is it some of the above, or is it all of the above? All right, we're all done. That's good. Oh, yeah, I thought it's that. Right, so 5 of you got it right. So the way to think about this, it's not a prevalence, it's not the probability of encountering Listeria. So it doesn't mean to say every time you go to your supermarket, you're going to get a dose of Listeria. What it really means is that when Listeria is there, which is 1.4% of the time in the case of retail slice, then it's going to be, the probability is going to be around about 2 log rather than a lower one, which is for the retail pack. So that's the way you get it. So what you're talking about here, and I think you get the idea, is saying, well, will it be an infectious dose? Will it cause outbreaks? Is that all right? Or you can chat, say, go over it again. All right, fair enough. All right, so where are we going? Oh, yeah. So, but this isn't the whole story, is it? Because with retail sliced meat, it's got a short shelf life. It dries out very quickly. And, we talked about over time, isn't it? Saying, well, if you encounter Listeria, it does grow over time, especially if you've got no inhibitor there. So you're kind of balancing things out. Retail packs, or should we say pre-packed meat, has a shelf life of about 60 days, whereas sliced meat retail has around 5 days. So again, there's an opportunity to grow. So when we come to all those factors, prevalence, infectious dose, frequency, we kind of put them all together and to a final risk characterization. So, and we can do this by looking at the prevalence, I say, the infectious dose and the risk factors associated with storage and things like that. Now, what we can do with that data is do what we call qualitative risk assessment. And qualitative risk assessment is essentially just ranking. Oh, yeah, sure. Which part do you want to go over again? Is it from the not from the start, hopefully, from the cumulative curve? Well, I'll go for, I think this is a part, isn't it? You're not sure about. All right, then. So I'll go over this part. So cumulative factors is essentially a probability. It's taking different things into account. So in this study, what they did, yeah, it's all right. So in this study, what they did is they went out and they got 3,500 packs of pre-packed deli meat and 3,500 packs of retail sliced deli meat, and they looked for Listeria. And so what they found from the data is that pre-packed meat was around about 0.17% prevalence of Listeria. So 0.1.7% of the samples harbored Listeria. When they did find Listeria, it was very low numbers, below 0 log CFU or MPN, whichever you prefer. Now, when they came to the retail slice and encountered Listeria, which was 1.4% of the time, because Listeria is present in the environment, they encountered it mainly at high, well, 2 log CFU, not high levels, is it? So from this, what they can do is work out a probability curve. So all this curve is telling you essentially, is saying, if you go out to retail and you get it sliced at the deli counter, and it does contain listeria, and it doesn't always contain listeria, but when it does, it's likely they're going to be at levels of 2 log CFU most of the time. Now, there is a chance it'll be less, because you can go down to a low number, but that's unlikely. When it's going to be there, it's going to be at this sort of level. Now, in pre-packed deli meat, when you do encounter listeria, which is very rare, it's going to be at low levels. And what this tells you is about what is going to be likelihood of having an infectious dose. Is that all right, or is it still unclear? Oh, I can't hear anything. All right. I think you get the idea. But then you've got to take into account things like, you've got to take into account, will it grow? And will it grow to dangerous levels? That's all right. Good. So qualitative risk assessment is basically where we kind of rank things. So we're kind of saying, well, deli meat's going to be more dangerous than soft cheese, things like that. It doesn't tell you about the risk as such, but it tells you saying, well, eating deli meat is more dangerous than eating soft cheese, if it is. Well, that's based on expert opinion most of the time, which is always a bit dangerous, isn't it? But when we get numbers, it enables the statisticians to do what we call quantitative risk assessment. So with quantitative risk assessment, we can actually start putting probabilities on things about what's the chance of getting listeriosis from this portion of caviar, or what's the chance of getting it over a year? All these kind of things. Do simulation models, and as I was mentioning to you, simulation models are, if you believe them or not, kind of thing. But we'll say we can. So what we're able to do then, because are based on our risk assessment. So because we've got numbers, we can start looking at probabilities. Like I say, what is it per serving? What is it per annum? Which food should we focus on? And uncertainty graphs gives you kind of a range of probabilities, saying, well, the probability could be between point X and Y. We're not exactly sure, but these are the kind of ranges. That's uncertainty graphs. So what we end up with is this sort of model then, where we feed the numbers in, what we know about prevalence, ability to grow, likelihood of encountering an infectious dose. And from our data, we can say, well, if we've got this amount of exposure, this dose, our likelihood, our death rate could be X per annum, per year. And we have these multiple factors or correction factors, and these are based on basically mortality, illness to mortality ratio. So essentially what it's saying, what is the chances of dying? And as you mentioned, because of listeriosis is so severe, you're going to get more chance of having a fatal outcome if you're elderly or you're immunocompromised. So that's their correction factors. But at the end of the day, isn't it, you've got rates per annum and rates per serving. And from this point, what you can do is you work out, well, from that data, what is the most dangerous food you can have linked to listeria? And it turns out to be deli meat. Surprise, surprise, isn't it? You could have told that by the outbreaks. So you're essentially ranking them, aren't you? So when you come to do a HACCP or inspection, you can prioritize the different food systems. And obviously, deli meats and listeria are very high up in that. So basically, what it says in all that risk assessment is retail is a significant hazard place for listeria. We know deli meats, particular, can harbour listeria for one reason or another, and we have to prioritize that, which it is. In industry, you've got listeria regulations, you test for it, and things like this. And what we can do is this cluster analysis just to kind of rank the risk, isn't it? So per serving, for example, we have deli meats at both per annum and per serving. We also have unpasteurized milk. But if you notice, per serving unpasteurised milk's in the high risk cluster 1, whereas when per annum, it's quite down the sort of tree, isn't it? I think it's in, see where it is. I think it's in cluster D or something like that. But why do you think that is? So why do you think per the ranking of milk per serving is very high, but per annum it's way down the charts? Is it because on average raw milk is safe? Is it that raw milk is drunk or consumed occasionally? Is it because raw milk is permitted for sale in low number of locations? Or is it some of the above, but not all? Yeah, I think everyone should get this. Oh, no, not maybe. So basically, what it's really telling you is that raw milk is a big risk, as we talked about. But the thing is, people don't drink it every day. They only drink it occasionally. So per serving is a high risk, isn't it? But overall, when you think about the frequency, it's at a lower risk. So, Six, you got it right. Well done. So risk management then is how we're going to tackle listeria. Well, essentially with listeria, we've got regulations, the sanitation and environmental monitoring and product testing. And so what we try to do is get interventions, be it to remove listeria. And in the US and in Canada, we have different ways of doing this. So in the US, they have a zero tolerance policy for listeria, and they have something called alternatives. And so with these alternatives are giving the industry options for control of listeria. So if you have a post-lethality treatment, high pressure processing, with antimicrobial diacetate, then you're in alternative 1. Now, what you can have, you could have high pressure processing, or you could have the antimicrobial and a good environmental sanitation program, not both, and that's alternative 2. Then alternative 3 is where you basically you only have sanitation, you haven't got high pressure, you haven't got validated interventions, and you have a hold and release policy testing. Now you might think saying, oh, well, alternative 3, the cheapest one, isn't it? But by being alternative 3, you open yourself up to increased scrutiny, both in terms of testing and both in terms of inspection. So as you can imagine, companies like to get to alternative 1 because they get less testing requirements, less audit and less inspection. Now you'll be surprised to look at some of these figures. So USDA essentially just require voluntarily to test products and lines twice two times every 6 months. And you might think, wow, that's so infrequent. But this is the consequence of their risk-based or their lack of or zero tolerance system. Because what they do is that when they find this stuff, you have to recall, and they know the recall causes detrimental damage to the market and confidence. So they do much less testing, and the FDA, as we'll talk about in a little bit, has a different routine because they've got a different jurisdiction on products. We'll talk about that in the next unit. Now, in Canada, what we have is that we have a risk-based system where we categorize products and facilities into different parts. So category 1 is where we've got ready-to-eat products that can support the growth of listeria. Category 2A, which ones that we usually apply an intervention and we keep levels below 100 CFU. So when we say that, we're essentially saying that we've got methods that can detect 100 CFU, but not lower than that. That's what it really means. Doesn't mean say you can send out listeria positive product. And then category 2B are things like dried ingredients. They can't support the growth of listeria. And the thing is that with category 1, because we've got a risk-based system, we focus a lot of inspection on there, testing and things like that. But with category 2A, we do less so because we know we've got interventions like high pressure, diacetate, and all these things. And I want to just, well, I've only got 2 slides, but I'll see if you can see this one. So the thing is, if we're in category 1, and we've got to say, no, we're in category what would it be? Oh yes, it'll be 1, but it wouldn't grow within the shelf life of a product. Which sampling plan would you use? So this comes back to what we talked about before. So which sampling case would you do for end product testing of Listeria monocytogenes for a product that would not support the growth of Listeria for the designated shelf life? So we're not saying that it doesn't support the growth of Listeria. It's what we're really saying is that not within that shelf life of a product. And this would be in the category 1 sector. Yeah, just got 2 more slides to go, so I might as well finish it. All right. See if, a bit all over the map, isn't it? So this would be case 11, isn't it? So it's case 11 because we know Listeria is serious. You know, some people would say severe, but all in all, a number of cases, it's serious. And we know it's not going to grow within that timeline. So when we're doing category 1, for example, they'll literally do challenge trials where they'll say, well, by this time, 9 days, whatever it is, the Listeria wouldn't have started growing. And on that basis, you would choose this sampling plan. So, you know, bringing the sampling plan together. All right, so the last slide. So as I mentioned to you, at the end of the day, you have to do risk communication. And that's not only communicating to industry, but communicating to the high-risk groups, isn't it? You know, we talked about saying how you should advise certain population to don't consume certain products. I remember the Public Health Agency of Canada talking about romaine lettuce and E. coli, saying, well, you know, we advise you not to consume this lettuce. I think it was very lousy messaging again, but communication is a hard bit, and you can see in this sort of age of COVID how hard it is. You know, we haven't really got over the mask sort of, do you wear masks or don't you wear masks? So really what you have to do in communication is think about the best way to translate it. Is it through being nice to companies and advising, educating them? Or is it more of a sharp shock? And it is a very difficult means of communicating. And I think the most successful communication plan that I ever saw was over in the UK. And what they were looking at is trying to advise people not to wash chicken before they cook it. Now, back in the day, when I was young, they used to advise to wash chicken, and for whatever reason. And you know, by washing chicken, you're going to get contamination everywhere on the sink, and it doesn't really make a difference because you're cooking it. So what the FSA, the Food Standards Agency, did is do a campaign where they hit websites, TV, radio, commercials in one day, all of them. And they got something like 20 million hits or something like this. So really what it's saying in communication, you've got to make it transparent. You've got to make it effective. And you can't just put it on the website and hope people read it, things like that. All right, so I'm going definitely over time now. So we'll start the next unit on Friday. And as I mentioned to you, I'll talk about the final exam format in the last lecture because there's no point in doing it now. And we should hopefully the internet connection is going to be a bit better on Friday. Okay.
I just
Yep, sure.